Blog Talk Radio.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this episode 34 of the show about the show. I have a very, very cool and unique guest on today. I have Ken Mars. He is an author and a documentarian. He has a website dedicated to the history of baseball in the city of Baltimore, specifically from 1858 to 1953. We're going to talk about many, many different things. We're going to talk about his book, being an author, we are going to talk about his documentaries, and we are also going to talk about his artistry as well as being a member of the Sabre Babe Ruth chapter. So it should be a fun half an hour, and without any further ado, I am pleased and honored to bring on Ken Mars. How you doing, Ken?
Well, I'm good, Devlin. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about BaltimoreBaseballHistory.com, which is kind of which is your website. Tell me a little bit about why you decided to do the history of the city of Baltimore.
Well, I live in the area. I have since the early 80s, and when I moved here, one of the first things I learned about the Orioles is that the old American League Orioles in 1902 eventually became the New York Yankees. And I just thought that was utterly preposterous and couldn't possibly be true. Lo and behold, right. And so it really just, like I moved into an area that had a lot of mystery to it. And certainly, and I'd always kind of read baseball books, but when you're a kid, usually it's that sort of, scholastic books and Grosset and Dunlap kind of things that you find in the library. But still, after the Ken Burns documentary came out, a lot of really great baseball books came out, like in the late 80s and early 90s, but they still didn't answer my questions. So it just sort of became this thing that stuck in the back of my mind that I didn't really know the answers that I really wanted. And it wasn't really until the internet really started to really blossom and newspaper archives really took off that I could actually do something about it and find out what these things were. And it just, it got a little out of control, and now there's a book and a documentary.
And a lot of people, I don't think casual baseball fans, certainly fans who haven't seen Ken Burns documentaries, know that baseball predates the U.S. Civil War by, 20 years or so. Can you kind of talk about those early years in baseball? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that was one thing that constantly surprised me. The fact that it's so old and intertwined, there was really a movement around then to come up with some sort of American sport. Certainly after the War of 1812, cricket and all things English had sort of fallen a bit out of favor, but that's just what everybody played. They just played cricket. It's really no secret that baseball is based off of rounders, which is an English game, but it was really just these middle management businessmen who could take off of work, who wanted to goof around, who still kind of had this playful child-like quality in them, and that's where baseball comes from. Is that it's really just men who refused to stop playing, so they came up with a game that they could play. There weren't really many team sports back then. Soccer is a lot of running. It's not for everybody. And things like, rugby and, you can't play that every day. It's just games right. You can't really, And baseball was what they kind of settled on. It was a long process. And certainly it wasn't really until after the Civil War that everybody started playing the same game. Regionally, there were a lot of differences. And even after there were printed rules, it doesn't mean that they were taken on. But during the war, a lot of troops played for camaraderie, and that was a really big part of camp culture. And when those guys went home, they started a lot of teams, and it just it really just exploded after that.
A lot of really kind of town ball and kind of, I guess what we might call today Legion teams. Is that right?
Yeah, everything starts kind of regionally. I don't think Baltimore's story is very much different. It's pretty close to what happened in New York. It all starts with one team, and then from there you need somebody to play against, and then you have to agree on those rules. And then once you agree on those rules, wouldn't it be great if there was another team to play against? So it's just sort of like, and then you're always going to have, in that early era, you're always going to, in every region, you're going to have that top tier of, 2 or 3 teams. And then you have, the masses of clubs that come and go year after year because there was no real stability, and it wasn't just the availability of equipment was a really big deal. I mean, baseball might not exist if it wasn't for Daniel Lucius Adams pitching the Knickerbockers baseballs for years and years because there was nobody else that would do it. So, once it finally caught on enough to be a fad, what happens next? Somebody wants to make money off of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of talk about that early history right before the Civil War, right about 1858 or so. You had the Baltimore Excelsiors. Tell people who might not be familiar with that about kind of that era in Baltimore.
Well, the Baltimore was pretty rough back then. Still can be today. But during the 1850s, the city was controlled by political gangs. And there was an offshoot of the Whigs called the Know Nothings, who make Donald Trump look rather sensible, shall we say. And these guys, and basically this political party, they were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and they hired street gangs, not only in Baltimore but in other cities, to Shanghai voters and get you to vote 3-4 times, and they would disrupt the polling places. And Baltimore was in the middle of this span of about 4 or 5 years of consecutive election day riots, where these street gangs, the Rip Raps and the Plug Uglies, they rioted and people died, and that happened for 5 years straight. And in the middle of that, George Bean started the Baltimore Excelsiors, and he was a businessman, and he took a stand against that, and he was actually got beat up a couple of times in 1858 and 59 trying to defend the polling places. And George Beam is technically Baltimore's first baseball player, and he didn't play more than 2 years. And I think it's partially because he got a bad knocking. I think in 59 he was arrested by the police and beaten by the police and then thrown in jail, and then they let him out, and then he was beaten in public. And he was just trying to do the right thing and have fair voting, but there was no rhyme or reason to any of it. It was just the politicians who wanted to be in power stayed in power basically until the Civil War, when Baltimore was occupied by federal troops. I don't know. That's it in a nutshell.
Well, and they actually ended up, the Excelsior Baseball Club actually played at Druid Hill Park, and during those Civil War years that you talked about, the Excelsiors actually became the Baltimore Pastimes, but they saw a lot of competition kind of rise up around them, didn't they?
Yeah, even though in a very short time, baseball really took off in Baltimore. It's really just a couple of years behind the big wave in New York. The Baltimore Excelsiors were named after the Brooklyn Excelsiors. They have ties. Joseph Leggett was a friend of George Beams, and so right around when the war happens, there was a real big, there was probably about like a dozen, 20, maybe to 20 teams that were active, but it's hard to say what really happens once the war starts because all the newspaper coverage turns to the war. Nobody cares about recreational games. This is obviously, before organized sports pages, and it was just sort of, when you go looking for this stuff in the old papers, you have to look under the announcements and you have to look under the miscellaneous section because there is no sports page. And with Baltimore, it's very frustrating because it's almost like every other year they get another editor and then you have to find it in some other place. Sometimes it's, it's feast or famine sometimes. So during the Civil War, I think, baseball sort of went into recession in Baltimore. It was a very prosperous time for the city. Everything going south came to Baltimore. Soldiers stopped here on their way to Washington, and so the city really profited. And it was the first time in a very long time that the only reason why you weren't working is because you didn't want to. That wasn't always the case. It was
Sure.
It was a very prosperous time. Enoch Pratt, who opened up the Pratt Library. That's where he made his fortune during the Civil War. Harry Vonderhorst's father, Harry Vonderhorst, eventually owned the Orioles in the 90s, but that's when his father made his fortune and then opened up the Eagle Brewery, which allowed his son to buy the Orioles many years later.
Now, let's fast forward a little bit to the 1880s. They had the American Association. That was a club that did so poorly that the club was renamed the Orioles in 1883. And for many, earlier. That's actually not true. That's actually not true. Those are two separate clubs. Actually, the 1882. This is one of those things that always perplexed me when I was doing my research. But in 1882, the Baltimore Baseball Club was a last-minute addition to the American Association. They were really propped up by Pittsburgh, and one of their players, Henry Myers, who had played in Baltimore the previous couple of years, was picked by Denny McKnight. He was, he owned Pittsburgh, and he was also the American Association president. So he picked Myers to run the Baltimore team, and it did so poorly. But Baltimore was a valuable territory because the National League wasn't here. So they basically just took the club at the end of the year away from Myers without asking, eventually getting him to sign it away. And originally Brooklyn was going to be in Baltimore's place. So they basically gave it back to the owner of the Brooklyn team, Bill Barney, who decided to take over the Baltimore franchise and not mess with New York. So Bill Barney ended up starting the Orioles in 1883, along with Alphonsus Hoke, who was owned in Baltimore for 15 years at that point. He's a very forgotten, but he's a very important but forgotten figure in our history. Now, if we talk about the 1880s Orioles, I think we have to kind of talk about the Orioles of the Beer and Whiskey League. They were that league in general was kind of a failure, but those guys especially were pretty scandal-ridden, weren't they?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, the Beer and Whiskey League is definitely it lives up to its name. Baltimore definitely they weren't a great team. They had a couple of brief moments of brilliance, but unfortunately they were brief. But yeah, there was a lot of umpire baiting, riots at games, a lot of fights. Players getting arrested. I mean, there's a couple of stories in my book of guys, having drunken brawls, and it was just year after year. And it wasn't just the Orioles; it was the entire league. But the Orioles, in particular, they just perpetually didn't have much money. Harry Vanderhorst was a minor partner, and he was a silent partner for several years. His father didn't want him getting involved. His father thought he should run the brewery, and eventually his father was correct. But at the time, Harry wanted to get into baseball, but he didn't have the money to put into it. And the Orioles weren't a great team, so they didn't draw, and it ended up being this cycle where they just didn't have much of a budget. And when they did get a good guy, they couldn't put anything around him. So, when they finally get Matt Kilroy, who, still has, the major league strikeout record and wins record for lefties, they couldn't do anything with him. They just kept on putting him out day after day after day, and this young kid got bitter about it really fast. And then, in his, second big season, he took a really bad injury to his throwing hand kind of early in the season, and that was it. Matt Kilroy never really pitched the same again, but for about a year or so, he was just, more dominant than any other guy. I mean, he's one of the great should-have, would-have, could-have. But, he unfortunately, when he finally healed up, he just didn't really have it again.
And all of these can be found in the book that Ken mentioned earlier, and I can't believe it took me this long to mention, Baltimore Baseball, First Pitch to First Pennant. It is available on BaltimoreBaseballHistory.com. Ken, you actually had something kind of cool happen on April 20th. You got to have a pretty nice speaking invitation. Where were you speaking, and what were you talking about?
That was the SABR 19th Century Conference up in Cooperstown, New York, at the Hall. It was really cool. Okay. I haven't done a lot of public speaking, but I've been trying to the last few years. I'm getting better at it, or at least comfortable, which I'm okay with that. I can live with comfortable. But yeah, it was fun. I presented. I did for my book. I traced it all the way up to 1894, and one of my favorite historical players is John McGraw. And much like Baltimore baseball history, John McGraw's history always perplexed me, because I'd read all the major books, and they contradicted each other. So I was like, well, who's right? Is this one right? Is this part correct? Is that? And it was, a lot of it was, his mostly his childhood. And I got really kind of, really just somewhat obsessed with figuring out what was the real John McGraw, because there's the myth and the legend, and then there's the man. So right. I started looking into his childhood, and I found an ancestor of his online, Mike McGraw, who'd done a rather extensive family genealogy, and then putting that together with stuff that I'd looked up, it was sort of like, wow, I have a much better picture. And when I went up to Cooperstown, I stopped in John's hometown of Truxton, New York, and met with Don McCall, the town historian, and he told me a whole bunch more. And now I'm working on a documentary on John McGraw, because it's a really good story. And I'm hoping to have that done sometime next year.
Yeah, and that, if according to your website, that is called Little Napoleon, The Life of John McGraw. Is that correct? And it shows fall 2019? Yeah,
I'm hoping. That's the working title right now. Probably what we're going to. Sure. That's probably what we'll go with. But yeah, hopefully, we're going to go back to Truxton, hopefully before the fall, and shoot some more stuff. I went up there. We were up there in mid-April, and it was snowing. And we went up to John's birthplace. We figured out where that was, and And we found out where his family was living, and we went there, and there was snow all over the place. And I looked at my friend David, who was working on the movie with me, and I was like, well, I guess it's historically accurate because he was born on April 7th, and it's the 20th now. So, it was pretty. His family was failed farmers, mostly because they had bad choice of land, and they about within 6 months of John being born, there was a huge national depression, and the family lost 2 farms, and they were left penniless. By the time he was 1, so he really literally did start from nothing.
And if you go on to Ken's website, BaltimoreBaseballHistory.com, and you click on the top, there's different tabs. There's books and films and store. If you click the films tab, there is a Baltimore Baseball Before the Birds, 1858 to 1881. And something kind of cool about this is it was the official selection for the 2017 Baseball Hall of Fame Film Festival. So in addition to doing your speaking engagement that you had here about 8 weeks ago, you are also a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Not real. I would like to think so.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it was a real kick. I did get a real kick out of speaking there. That was pretty neat. The film festival was pretty cool. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go up there to see it. They announced that you were in it just a little too close to the showing date. And I should have just, planned on going up there, but I'm always, like, they're not going to take it or whatever. And, but of course they did,
sure.
And, I was really happy with that. And, I'll submit the John McGraw documentary when I get that done, and I will go up there for that because, I was just so heartbroken that I couldn't go. That would have been so neat.
Now let's talk a little bit
I'm happy it's in there.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Old Frog, the cards and pictures and stuff you do, because we're friends on Facebook, and I see a lot of these cards and stuff that you do. Are these your drawings of cards?
Yeah. I've always drawn since I was a kid. Robots, spaceships, stuff like that, and. When I was working on my book, I originally I was going to have a lot of his illustrations and stuff, and I found that there weren't any maps that I really needed that showed where the ballparks were. So that's kind of where it all started. Is I wanted these maps to show the ballparks and draw some sort of just rough renderings of what I thought that these parks looked like, because there just weren't any. And from there, I started looking at pictures of some guys that I wanted to have in my book, and I just started drawing them. And, it just sort of like took off from there. I posted some online and got some, really kind of unexpected responses. I mean, I don't think my stuff's like, it's no Greg Kreindler or Dick Perez, that's for sure. But, I mean, I draw, they paint. It's kind of like apples and oranges.
Absolutely.
And, it just sort of like picked up, and I found that I really, really liked it. I always liked drawing, but I was always good at it if I had a purpose behind it. Like, like if I used to draw comics, so that was the goal. You finish the comic book. And so then, when I got into doing baseball guys, I noticed I had about half the Lord Baltimore's done. I was like, well, I could just draw the other 5 guys, and I'd have I'd have the whole team. It just sort of like, blossomed. It just kind of like turned into this arts and crafts project. And, it just took off. I sold a few copies and really underestimated how long it took to make these sets. So right now I'm getting ready to put out my 3rd big set. And I'm going to reboot the whole series because otherwise I'm only going to be able to put out like 30 or 40 or 50 of these instead of, try and make it a little bit more collectible. So instead of making big boxes that cost like $150 to $200, I'm going to make packs. So, and you'll have the option to buy it by teams now. But it's really just, I wasn't thinking about that when I started out. So, this summer it's going to change into more of a collectible thing, and you'll be able to pick up a pack on eBay for, 10, 15, $20 or whatever.
Fantastic. And everything will be hand-drawn by Ken. On his website, BaltimoreBaseballHistory.com, if you go to the store, he has a copy of his book, Baltimore Baseball, First Pitch to First Pennant. Covers the years 1858 to 1894. We spent a majority of this podcast talking about that. It is 350 pages. It is you can order it. It does take about 2 to 3 weeks for delivery. You can also, he has his PayPal information as well as the his where you can find it on eBay, and he also has one of his documentaries called Baltimore Baseball, Before the Birds, 1858 to 1881. This is a Blu-ray special edition. It's the 80-minute feature with a 22-minute bonus film called Early Black Baseball in Baltimore.
Yeah,
and
that's coming soon. Yeah, it's coming soon. Working on it.
Absolutely.
There's only so many hours in a day. Yeah. Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, and it should be really exciting, and I really, really hope that people take the time to check out your website, because I'll tell you guys, I mean, he knows his Baltimore baseball history, and it goes way past just Babe Ruth being born in Baltimore, and like he said, he's writing a book about John McGraw, and John McGraw actually played with Ned Hamlin and guys like that for those old Baltimore teams in the late 1880s. So definitely make sure you are supporting Ken. Again, his films and his website is BaltimoreBaseballHistory.com. It is all one word. His book is Baltimore Baseball, First Pitch to First Pennant, 1858 to 1894. He also has a Blu-ray that is coming soon. He's a very, very busy man. He is also working, like he mentioned, on the John McGraw book. He also has a book called The Geography of Baltimore Baseball, which is going to be a book of maps, which sounds very, very cool. And the sequel, yep, and in the works as well, the sequel to First Pitch to First Pennant is called Baltimore Baseball Hit and Run, which I'm assuming is going to talk about the famous Baltimore chop where they hit the ball into the ground and get the really high hop.
Sure. Yeah, I stopped. I stopped the first book where I did because there's a really good book out there called Where They Ain't by Bert Solomon that I highly recommend. And I didn't want to just repeat what he did, even though we're talking about the same era. So I kind of have my story broken down a little differently than he does. So when I pick it back up, it's the Orioles are really the height of their badness in the 1890s. They were real bad boys of baseball and kings of the diamond. And then it takes it all the way through to, when the Orioles become the Yankees and sort of the downfall there, and then Baltimore's exile into the minor leagues. And so I always thought that period was very interesting. And I had to kind of stop where I stopped it so I could end it on a high note, and then the next one's not going to be such a high note. Because there's a lot of highs and lows in Baltimore baseball history. You could make them all highs. You could end every book on a high or a low, depending on how you wanted to break it down. But, I mean, that's going to take a little while. I mean, it took me well over a decade to write the first one. So the sequel's not going to be in your bookshop next week. That's for sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, the amazingly talented author, Saber Babe Ruth chapter, speaker at the Baseball Hall of Fame, as well as filmmaker, documentarian, and just all-around great guy, Ken Mars. Ken, I cannot thank you enough for joining me on the program, and let me know when that Blu-ray comes out, and I will buy a copy of it from you.
I will do. All right, thanks, Devlin. I really appreciate you having me on.
No problem. Thanks for coming on. Bye-bye.
All right, have a good one. Bye.
You too, thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Ken Mars. He is an author and a documentarian, man. That guy knows his stuff. He is if you want to talk about early baseball in Baltimore, he's the guy to talk to. Like I said, I'm friends with him on Facebook. I've seen a lot of his cards and drawings, the Old Frog pre-1900 cards, and he's amazing. So if you get a chance, check out his website, BaltimoreBaseballHistory.com. We're going to take a quick break, and then we will be back with our third and final episode of the day. We'll see you all down the road in podcast land.